52 weeks ago, I launched this podcast right in the middle of an actual business emergency. And today we're celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the business emergency room with a look back, a big lesson from that actual emergency a year ago, and a major giveaway worth over $5,000 at the end for one of you. So please stick around. We have a lot to share today.
Leadership today isn't just about scaling. It's about navigating constant uncertainty, market disruptions, and high-pressure decisions. If you're dealing with chaos, bottlenecks, and relentless pressure, welcome to the Business Emergency Room.
Welcome to the Business Emergency Room, live recorded in Genoa. I had a bit of a business emergency myself, trying to find space to actually record. So apologies if you still hear somewhat of an echo. It's not my best recorded location, but let's do this, right? When I hit record for that first episode, I wasn't thinking about statistics and rankings or download numbers. I just knew that too many business leaders, especially in high growth, high stakes environments, were getting blindsided by problems they should have seen coming or could have seen coming. That too many of us spin around in the space where we think we can climb out, only to drift further. So I built this podcast for you, to give you the tools to lead through the chaos, to navigate it, to fix issues before they show up by seeing the symptoms, and to help you hear and see how I and others have triaged the situation so that maybe those stories become tools in your toolkit. And to keep making progress, even in this crazy, volatile, uncertain, and complex, ambiguous world that is changing faster by the day. And the great news is that based on your feedback, that intent, it's working. Because you've told me that the podcast helps you take action, has helped you make decisions. It has helped you to move past analysis. And you've told me that it helps you bring clarity when things got messy or were messy. And maybe most importantly of all, many of you have told me that it reminds you that you're not alone. And yes, most of the stuff we are experiencing is unique to us. But in its fundamentals, it's not unique to the world. And there's others going through similar things. And I hope with this podcast that we can learn from each other. Because let's be honest, we need all of us, and you especially, to succeed. Because you are building services and launching systems and scaling in organizations and in businesses and on products that matter. They are going to change how we live. They are going to make us make progress, and they're going to help us thrive. And my mission is to help you succeed in that with more clarity. And hopefully free up a little bit more time so there's also more time to enjoy the rest of your life. The other things, as I'm currently doing, because I'm recording this live from Genoa, which was actually not all that simple, and hence the somewhat echo chamber. That's life, right? A little improvisation. All right. So about the emergency case that we want to talk about and learn from today. As this episode airs, it's the anniversary, or this week is the anniversary of the CrowdStrike incident that brought major industries to a standstill. And it wasn't just a headline. To me, it was personal. Because I was flying home from Geneva to New Orleans that day with my kids after a 5-week trip. And on the very early drive to the airport during that morning, I started seeing alerts. So there was delays in Dubai, and there was issues with flights in Australia. And it was very clear that something big was brewing. We personally made it through check-in, but as soon as we got to the gate, the news broke wide open. We were not going anywhere fast. And we were due home. I mean, it'd been 5 weeks. My husband was waiting. My work week was super packed with in-person stuff. And Geneva is expensive at the best of times, but it was midsummer and it was festival weekend. What are we going to do there? We were stuck in the chaos. But let's zoom out for a second and see what we can learn from this specific example. So what happened was that CrowdStrike pushed a flawed update to what was called its Falcon sensor software. The ironic thing is that CrowdStrike actually built systems and software that is supposed to protect businesses' systems from attacks. So it's actually safety type software. Like any other stuff, they run automatic patches and updates. And this is kind of a low-key update that they just ran on some of their standard software that is very widely deployed. And within minutes, millions of Windows machines began crashing. And everybody got to see the blue screens. The blue screens that those of you who are my age will probably remember, but many of the current generation hadn't seen ever. And in some cases, the update actually disabled the whole reboot recovery. So standard control delete kind of thing wasn't working. And so what happened was that CrowdStrike did release the fix within 78 minutes, which is, not bad. But the challenge was that it required manual intervention. So you had to boot up in safe mode and then delete the faulty file. And they eventually got to some automated updates. So that wasn't 2 days later. So to actually recover from this, it's a very labor-intensive process. Well, the ripple effect on business was huge. Suddenly, global airlines, hospitals, banks, and retailers really blindsided. There was widespread aviation disruption, ranging from London, Paris, Frankfurt, New York, Tokyo. The American Airlines, who were all big users of this, particularly got hit. And of course, they fly everywhere. And then there was also some specific airports that were using systems that were using this software and hence were struggling. If we look at the American Airline, or the American Airlines, specifically American Airlines, they recovered actually relatively fast. And afterwards, their CEO, Robert Isom, he credited their resilient crew tracking protocols. United, which is who I was traveling with, took days to recover. And it depended a little bit where we were, but eventually they got it back up in somewhat reasonable time. Delta, however, they suffered the most. They had over 7,000 canceled flights. They had 1.3 million passengers stranded. They had a $500 million loss, and they actually were slapped with a DOT investigation. They did not manage to come back from this quick at all. The only one who seemed to have escaped the whole thing was Southwest. And you all know that we talked about Southwest a few times and some of their challenges on this podcast. So the assumption is that they were likely running on older systems, which were untouched by the update. Lucky for them. There was also impact in retail and healthcare. So 7-Eleven, Starbucks, and Waitrose, they faced payment outages, and some stores had to switch to cash or shut. And hospitals in both the US and UK, they had to pause any non-urgent procedures, and they scrambled to access patient records. I mean, this was truly a life or death situation for many people for a few days. Well, it was also true because this happened on a Friday. So you say, well, should have been worse, could have been Monday morning. But millions of workers globally were locked out of their PCs. And remember, it was a manual reboot. So imagine that you have thousands of employees, including many work remote these days, and they all have to show up somewhere and then the IT department physically to get their machines fixed or to be talked through it on the phone. That's huge, right? The incident underscored that IT outages are nobody's cyber attack excuse. They're actually real disruptions, right? You cannot just say, well, it wasn't us. Your business is going to suffer from this. What happened after? CrowdStrike actually accepted responsibility. And you saw apologies from their CEO, George Kurtz, and from their VP, Adam Myers. And they did outreach to lawmakers and a lot of public transparency. And yeah, I think there's lots of opinions about how they went about it. Say there's also definitely things that they could have done even better or improved upon, or things some of us might disagree with. But the truth of the matter is that they're still rebounded. And that in hindsight, analysts called it a masterclass in crisis response. That's pretty impressive considering the widespread impact of this. There were lawsuits though, because Delta, who lost $500 million, tried to get it back from CrowdStrike, and CrowdStrike then countersued. And there were investigations, and there was lingering reputational damage for almost anybody involved or affected, right? And it wasn't a hack. That's the craziest thing of it all, because that's what we typically think in situations like this, right? There is a cyber attack on our operations, but in this case, it was a failure in people and in processes and systems. So yeah, no code is perfect. And what matters is how we prepare and how we respond. So coming back to you, what are 5 key lessons that we can learn from this incident exactly a year ago that are actually relevant to all of us? And the first big one, of course, is the redundancy of systems and overrides, because Delta and United largely lacked manual workaround, whilst American Airlines somehow seemed to have ways to get back in their systems through backdoors to create flexibility and override things and make something work. So it's truly something to think about, and it should be part of your business continuity plan. What is the redundancy in your system, and how can you pull it back to more manual operations if there's a failure somewhere in the process? Which brings us to 2, you need crisis readiness that's beyond cybersecurity. I do believe that most of us these days really truly see the risk of being affected by a cybersecurity attack, because we've seen that happen and we've experienced it. And if I see an average business continuity plan or any risk mitigation planning, cyber attacks and data losses are definitely on the list. What I don't always see is the coverage beyond on that chain. So if the attack is there, it's not just about your IT system and the data, it's also about the integration of the interfaces from those systems with your vendors, access to data. Remember those hospitals that couldn't access anything? Your personnel, are they geared up to actually answer questions or feel empowered to move in the moment? Where is your customer care, like tracking of flights and rebooking? Is any of that? Which brings us to point number 3, which is you need clear escalation plans. Delta's excruciatingly slow recovery suggests that decisions got stuck in the system. I would assume that just like with the other 2 airlines, there was people in their system who wanted to do things, who wanted to help people, who wanted to get things back on track. Yet somehow, there is no doubt people who proposed things and tried to do things and didn't get anywhere. So was access to people who could make those decisions and empower people to get something moving and going, was that missing? Is it clear where people go? When senior leaders are on a event, this also happened in the summer holiday season, right? It happened at 6, 7 in the morning, European time, so it was even earlier in the US. I'm assuming not everybody's reachable. So what's then the next person you go to? Which brings me to point number 4, lesson number 4, which maybe at all times should be number 1, which is people first. In cases like this, your frontline staff, like at these airports, hospitals, etc., they were the ones dealing with the situation, right? They're handling this chaos under pressure, and supporting their well-being and clarity is non-negotiable. So is your staff trained or informed, or do they feel the trust and the space in those moments to either pull a protocol off a shelf and start working it, and where the protocol runs out of answers, do they then feel free to, in the moment, at least be human and start engaging with, in this case, people like me and say, okay, I don't have all the answers. This is what I do know. Working on it. We'll get back to you. But did they not say, I have absolutely no answers and no idea and I have no, and you're on your own, right? It's a very different response you're getting from people who feel empowered through the situation and might not have all the answers, or who feel that they have nowhere to go at all. Which leads us to learning number 5, and that's transparency builds trust. Because what happened is that CrowdStrike owned their mistake that day, the minutes, and they weren't even, being in the business I was in, I followed the communications that came out in the day, and many companies would have said a lot less than CrowdStrike did. Because if you don't know the details of the situation, the typical corporate response is to shut down to avoid legal cases. CrowdStrike actually was remarkably open and said maybe more than most would have in the situation. They also responded quickly. They apologized very publicly. And despite everything, and despite particularly that day and in the weeks after, nobody loved them, their stock did rebound. They did come back from this completely. Yet Delta, who was like me, a victim in the whole situation, realistically, faced absolutely massive backlash, despite also being a victim, right? So they got backlash for the fact, not that they weren't so affected, for the fact that they had no way back from this, that compared to their competitors, they were completely left. So even when you don't know everything, say what you do know, say what you're doing, because people can work with that and empower your people to make decisions on the ground as they see fit in the moment, because it shows that buys you way more goodwill than locking things down. For us, the whole CrowdStrike saga actually ended with some assertive and quick thinking employees. We were in a hotel room the next morning, still grumpy, but also resolute in thinking that we were going to figure something out to do for 3 or 4 days before we could get home. And just as we were trying to shore up our resolve, we got a text message saying that check-in was closing in less than 2 hours and that we hadn't checked in yet. And we weren't sure, but we raced to the airport anyway and made it to that check-in desk. Turned out that they'd send out this message because the plane that was supposed to fly us home the day before was supposed to get back to the US. And rather than have it fly empty, they texted everybody the only messages that they could from an automated system, hoping that some of them, like us, would be prompted to come to the airport. And so we were on that flight. We made it to mainland US, not knowing if we would have any onward connections, but at least a lot closer to home. That employee, by some quick thinking, or maybe there was 2 or 3 involved, really changed how we thought of United at the end of the situation and how we thought of the people that worked there. Their willingness to help and come up with some solutions that maybe were of use to some, priceless. All right. So, moral of the story is that one-line software update, it unraveled entire businesses. But it cemented for me this podcast mission because I just recorded some first episodes of the Business Emergency Room. And I was wondering whether with a title like that, I was maybe fear-mongering. This is not fear-mongering. This is what's happening on all sorts of scales. And most of us in our businesses are not prepared enough to deal with this. So we're here to bring more clarity and to help everybody else to get there, including you. This was a global IT infrastructure failure, and it was affecting everything. So the challenge is, how up-to-date and comprehensive is your actual business continuity plan? Is that what should address situations like this? And of course, you might say this was an extreme one, but what is so clear is that many of these business continuity plans don't go beyond a data breach or a security incident. What about all the other stuff, all the extra, the interfaces, the connections, the people? Park that thought for a minute, because before we get to the giveaway that ties directly into this, I want to take a quick moment to thank a few people for the anniversary episode, because none of this would have been possible without a few very key and important people First of all, I want to thank you all for tuning in week after week, providing me feedback, for being my reason for doing this, and for being at the other end of a speaker or wherever you're listening to this podcast. Thank you for being my audience. And thank you for sharing. I've had 25 guests in the last year. So yeah, I would like to thank all of them. I can't thank them all in person. That would take up the whole episode by itself, but I want to name a few specifically, especially my first guest ever on the podcast, my dear friend Tim Newman, who I really ran into again a few days ago, and was brave enough and willing to come out as my first guest. I've also made some new friends and collaborators through the podcast, which has been such an amazing part of this journey. I'm thinking of people like Jennifer Cresswell, Maxime Legal, Scott Calderwood, Keith Dorsey, and Mike Smith, who I crossed paths with thanks to this podcast and are now fabulous referral partners, peers, and professional colleagues. I also want to thank some of the familiar faces who returned to share wisdom, familiar to me. So people I know are specialists in their own expertise area and are willing to come on the podcast to deliver some fabulous content for you guys. I'm thinking of you, Bryce and Jeff, Bryce Wolston, Jeff Owens, Frank King, and Subir Chowdhury, and many more. Thank you for joining me on the podcast. Thank you for helping me out. Thank you, Meredith, also for being convinced to talk about the 2-lane emergency setup. Together, we've explored really topics all over the place, but all within the context of business emergencies. We covered hosted negotiation, family business succession planning, suicide prevention, AI deployment, cybersecurity, work performance, people power growth, when to let go, when to hone in, when to delegate, how to prioritize, all under one theme, making better decisions when it matters most so that your people dynamics also become more effective. And whether you're facing fast growth, failure, or full crisis, we've covered really also the full arc, I feel, from prevention to response to recovery. And here are some stats I only recently discovered. And as a listener, you know that I always have some statistics on the podcast. You know that if you publish a weekly podcast and you keep doing that consistently for over a year, that puts you in the top 5 to 10% of podcasts globally. I thought that was a great fact, and it made me a little gigglish and a little proud. It surprised me, but it also told me I must be onto something maybe. And I'm just getting started. I have no intent on giving up anytime soon. I have way too many more great and important topics and fabulous guests to bring on. So let me stop going on and on about the podcast. Happy 1-year anniversary to podcast. And how are we celebrating? Well, we're celebrating with a big giveaway. Not something I normally do, but because it's a 1-year anniversary and I appreciate that you're all listening and I want to keep going and I want to keep growing and I want to reach more people who might need to hear this. I'm having a giveaway, which is the business continuity plan upgrade. So the lucky winner gets a full review of your business continuity plan as is, and a written report and a consult on how to really take it to the next level. For the stuff like the CrowdStrike story we talked about, regardless of what state it's currently in. Yeah. If you want make your business ready to handle that next CrowdStrike type scenario, so what is it then that you need to do? So what I'm asking you to enter is there's 2 things you can do. And it's all about sharing and getting some extra eyes and ears on the podcast. Between the airing of this episode on July 16th and the end of the month, which is July 31st, so you have 15 days, you can either put something on social media associated with this podcast for me. So create a post on LinkedIn or another relevant professional channel. You can share or comment on any of my podcast-related posts or any of the posts of my guests. anything that mentions the podcast, sharing something about it, and tagging myself. And your name will be added to the list. Or if that's something that suits you better, wherever you're currently listening to this podcast, if you leave a review, we will pick up your name. So leave a review before the 31st of July on any specific episode or podcast overall, whatever suits you. Your name also gets entered on the same list. And then we will draw a lucky winner on the 31st of July and announce it on the first episode that airs in August. I would love to give you all a gift. So what I've decided is that all the names on the list will actually get, if you're not the lucky one winner, will get my business continuity plan upgrade checklist, which talks about all these subjects we typically don't think about in a standard business continuity plan. And so I think it's useful to at least make a step towards a more comprehensive plan. You get that checklist free if you help me share about the podcast in the next 2 weeks. So I'm excited about this. I hope that many of you help me out, which also brings me to the sad point that I have to end this first anniversary podcast episode. So thank you for being part of this wild and learning-filled emergency handling, clarity-seeking year. If this podcast has helped you, please help me keep it going by sharing. Even if a giveaway is not what convinces you, whatever you're willing to do, like, comment, share, or review. I've loved having you here today. I love having you here. Any other times or any other episodes, thank you for tuning in. And I hope to see you or hear you here next week. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of the Business Emergency Room. If you are currently dealing with chaos or disruption in your business, please reach out. You can email, text, or call, and I will find a way to connect with you within 24 hours. I've helped others steer out of the storm, and I know I can help you too. Talk soon. Please like, subscribe, and share.